So today we're looking at Chapter 13, Section 2. So let's run through a little bit of inflation and how it's measured and why it's so important. Okay, so this is based on the questions that you did yesterday on Section 2. The worksheet you'll work on today is the application of the idea of inflation. So hopefully this will help clarify the importance of inflation and knowing when inflation is coming. So with GDP, it's really important that we look at inflation. We all know what inflation is. You've seen it in your lifetime. It's the idea that the value of the dollar is decreasing, and because of that, prices are going up. So your money doesn't go as far as it used to. The problem with GDP and inflation, or when it's not considered, is it will distort the GDP. It could potentially make it look like we are producing more when in fact we're not. For example, if we were to look at the GDP in the 1920s, if you guys remember, that was the roaring 20s, things were very good. It was after World War I, and people had a lot of money to spend. So the economy was growing rapidly. If we were to take the dollar amount of the GDP, say for instance of 1922, and compare that with the GDP of 2008. In 2008, if you remember, that is the beginning of the Great Recession. So the economy in America was doing very, very poorly. But if we compare the GDP from 1922 to 2008, and we were just to look at the dollar amount of the GDP, the number in 2008 would be greater than in 1922. So we could, without taking inflation into account, we would draw the conclusion that the economy in 2008 was stronger than the economy in 1922 because the dollar amount was higher, and therefore more must be being produced. But that's not necessarily true. That's why we need to take inflation into account. You might remember from your studies that if you looked at the value of goods, prices in general were very low in 1922. So if we take the inflation out of the equation, then it allows us to be able to compare years like 1922 to 2008 accurately. Because if we do adjust GDP for inflation, we would then see that 1922's economy was far stronger than 2008. So it's really important that inflation be taken into account when we're figuring out GDP. The way that you take out the impact of inflation on the GDP is to use something known as a price index. And that price index, will end up being a mathematical equation. We won't be doing that, but just so you know, it is a mathematical equation. But a price index does remove the impact of inflation. And the way that that works, economists decide on a base year. Usually base years are in the beginning to mid 80s is usually when the base year that's used, very stable economic year. And that year basically serves as the baseline to compare other years to. So that base year will be the 100%. And the price index will allow us to look at price changes in terms of that base year. The way that they figure out the prices that were common in that very stable year is by having a market basket. And you can kind of think of that as like a supermarket basket. And the government prices the most commonly purchased items. And that price level from the base year is our 100%. And then our price index allows us to look at goods and prices of goods in different years as a percent of that 100. Okay. So let's look at our most common of our price index used for inflation is the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the BLS, is the government agency responsible for computing the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index, their market basket, so basically their shopping list of things they're going to buy, is about 80,000 items in about 364 categories, from food to fuel to entertainment to healthcare, all different areas where our common spending areas are taken into account. So basically what the government's going to do is they're going to go out and they're going to have their list of 80,000 items, so their shopping list, and they're going to go out each month and they're going to buy or price those 80,000 items. So in January, the BLS will price how much do those 80,000 items cost. They can't do this everywhere in the United States, so there's 85 different geographical areas that are representative of our country, from rural areas to suburban areas to urban areas. So they go out that first month in January, they price those 80,000 items. Then they're going to go out again in February and price those same 80,000 items. What they're looking for and what economists in general are looking for each month is, have the prices for those goods gone up or down? So they're looking at the receipt, essentially, if you will, that 80,000 items cost, you know, $50,000 in January, but in February those same 80,000 items cost $53,000, which shows that there is inflation in our economy. And all of those numbers are compared against that base year to see, has inflation gone up and how much has it gone up. It is compared to that base year. From this chart, you can see inflation is measured in tenths of a percent. Inflation is very dangerous for an economy, so it is always measured not in percents or 2% or 3%, but even tenths of percent. So you can see that in this particular chart. In addition to the consumer price index, we also have the producer price index, or the PPI. Whereas the consumer price index is what the average consumer is buying, the producer price index is what the businesses are buying. So it's looking at how much are businesses spending on their inputs. And instead of measured monthly like the CPI, this one is measured quarterly or every 3 months. Their price base year is 1996. That is their stable year that they compare. Are the prices of inputs going up, or are they going down, to see where is their inflation? And not usually, but if there happens to be any deflation where the value of the dollar is actually going up. Again, with inflation being as important as it is in our economy, you can see that the producer price index is also measured in tenths of a percent. When we have GDP that is not adjusted for inflation, you most likely will hear the term current GDP. That is GDP that is not adjusted for inflation. If GDP has been adjusted for inflation, we put the word real in front of GDP. So real GDP is, or it's also known as constant dollar GDP, is when the effects of inflation have been taken out of the GDP. And now we can compare that number to all different years to see how is our economy versus 2000 versus 1970. Mathematically, we can figure out real GDP or GDP adjusted for inflation by taking the current dollar GDP and dividing it by our price deflator, which is our price index. And because we're looking at these as percentages, then we multiply by 100, and that will give you your real GDP. So from this chart, we can see the growth in GDP over time. You can see in 2008 to around 2010, that's where we had our economic downturn with the Great Recession. Based on what you guys are seeing in the news today, you can kind of guess that you're going to see the GDP have some pretty big downturn as we've all been quarantined and people have not been spending their normal amounts. We'll look at that one later. Don't worry, that'll be fun. All right, so in terms of measuring growth, this is where we're going to start our section 3 for chapter 13.